So Katie and I are going to walk you through what is now a very long friendship and an almost equally long period of collaboration between the two of us. We're both practicing artists and have our own practices, but since 2008, a counterpoint or a sort of a big part of our practice is also working as collaborators in different forms, one of those being picture consequences, as Stacy mentioned. To give you a little bit of background information, in 1996 and 97, Katie was a student here at SVA, studying with a guy named Thomas Roma in her junior seminar class, and she made the picture on the right. That picture was made in 1990, around 1997-98. About a year later, 1998-99, I was a student of the same person, Thomas Roma, but at Columbia University, and I made the picture on the left. We're going to come back to this because this is sort of pulled from Picture Consequences, but we wanted to just introduce this as two pictures that we made before we knew each other in related circumstances that ultimately come together in 2011 in our show, Picture Consequences.
And you know, after Joe and I first met each other at Yale and discovered through various different conversations that we had both studied with with Thomas Roma, and then discovered that we had a lot of other shared experiences and backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, sort of solidified the friendship for sure. And then we also discovered that we had visual and aesthetic similarities as well.
Mm-hmm. So we overlapped. So after our undergraduate experience, Katie and I met officially in 2000 as graduate students at Yale University, where we studied with people like Philip Lorca-DeCorsia, Laurie Simmons, and Gregory Crutzen. Katie's going to talk a little, we're both going to talk a bit about some of the influences that we had as young photographers and our time in graduate school and how that's informed our practice and the ways in which we've also challenged those things which we were taught and sort of found our own path. So do you want to?
So before we can really talk about Picture Consequences, we sort of have to go through how we arrived at having this visual conversation. And one of the first things that we did together as a collaboration was to co-curate a show called Housed in 2010. Mm-hmm. And this show is a departure from a very seminal exhibition that was at the Museum of Modern Art in 1991 called Pleasures and Terrors of Domesticity, which was curated by Peter Galassi. And in that show, what Peter Galassi was doing was bridging the gap between modernism and postmodernism. And he found that the place where these two styles of photography or use of the medium met was in literally the kitchen and in the domestic space. And so these pictures happen to be both in our archive of images that influenced us and were influencing the works that we were making as undergraduate students while studying with Thomas Roma, who was also in that show.
As well as a number of our teachers that we had mentioned had been in this show. So many of the people that we had studied under were in this exhibition. And then we went on to study with those people. And as you can see in these photographs, this is from a project called Pictures from Home that Sultan made in the 80s into the 90s. And they're portraits of his parents who are in their retired years and their golden years of their life. And there's a sort of critical element because even though, I mean, the pictures are highly narrative. So one of the reasons we're including this as well is because we know that you guys are thinking about narrative and that many of the, all of the work in Pleasures and Terrors of Domestic Comfort were highly narrative photographs. And what's seminal in almost all of the work is the domestic space as a sort of stage on which a domestic narrative unfolds.
I'm just going to briefly read about the exhibition. The more than 150 images by 74 artists in Pleasures and Terrors were taken mostly during the 1980s when the home became increasingly the focus of photographic attention, as it became, not coincidentally, the focus of political attention and debates over issues like abortion, the family, and women's rights.
What's remarkable about the Pleasures and Terrors exhibition, beyond the fact that the photographs themselves are very strong, and there's a lot of great pictures by many photographers who you probably know, is that Galassi recognizes that in the 1980s, photographers like writers and filmmakers in the decades before that recognized the domestic space as a very rich subject matter where there's a lot of potential to make interesting work. So all of these photographs are made in and around the domestic space. There's a highly suggested, if not implicit, narrative. And these are things that Katie and I were both looking at as undergraduate students, and then together when we were studying with people like Gregory Crutzen as graduate students at Yale.
When Joe and I had gotten together, I guess it was more like 2009, and started to have this conversation about shows that we were seeing and works that we were interested in, we felt that there was this real void of some of the artists that we were most excited about. A lot of them were our colleagues and friends, but some of them were unknown to us personally. And in thinking about how this work and this show specifically influenced us and those who we studied with, we decided to kind of think about that stage as a source for all of these pictures, but as there was a departure with the people that we were looking at and interested in using the stage specifically.
And I think what we had the luxury in certain ways, and these pictures, as we said, were from an exhibition in 1991, and Katie and I come together around 2008 at a place called the Lyric Diner on 3rd Avenue and 22nd Street, which you may know. And we would meet, we were both teaching in the area at the time, and so we would meet once a week at least and have conversations around photography. And we both would go back to this exhibition as something that we were highly informed by, and we both love a lot of the work from this exhibition. But at the same time, we realized that the domestic is still an interesting subject matter, but so much about how we understand the domestic has changed because of new technology like the internet and surveillance, and also because of a blurring of public and private. So the idea of a private space was still pretty much, the boundary between public and private, I think, in 1991 was still relatively clear. But as you can imagine in 2008, with things like webcams and surveillance, these boundaries get a little bit blurrier. This is the work of Nan Golden, who I'm assuming many of you know. And so this is still work from the Pleasures and Terrors show.
You know, what was kind of remarkable and refreshing about this Pleasures and Terrors show was the fact that we were allowed access and entree into these private spaces through the photographers who would take us there. And most often they would take us there and had this access because they were looking at their own families and their own personal history. And here we see Tina Barney. And there's very few pictures in that show, if you can get your hands on the catalog, that don't have some reference to a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, a backyard. Mm-hmm. I mean, the literal staging of the domestic space.
The fireplace, the kitchen, the television set. So as we mentioned to you, in 2008, Katie and I were meeting, as we did regularly, as two good friends and two photographers with a lot of similar interests. And we decided that there was a lot of work dealing with domesticity that we are interested in, as we mentioned, that was not necessarily being seen, that was not exactly the same as what was in Pleasures and Terrors, but certainly had a relationship. And so we decided, since we're both influenced by that subject matter and still think it's worthy, but also thought that it needed to be readdressed, that we would come together and shift our roles as artists for a moment and step into the role as curators. I think it's important to note that we're not curators, we're artists, but that at this particular juncture we felt a kind of responsibility to actually, to our friends and to our peers and to our colleagues and even to our students, to acknowledge some of the trends that we were seeing, which were different than what was in the Pleasures and Terrors show from the early 90s.
And at this point, over a decade had passed, and I think that was important that all this time had gone by, and so much had shifted in terms of technology. Now, instead of having access through a photographer to get inside someone's personal space, we had webcams, and we had,
and reality TV,
TV, and other sources.
So, in the American, sort of in American culture, since 1991, when the Pleasures and Terrors show had happened, there were many ways in which people, not just in an art context, but in a popular context, were engaged with and interested in the domestic space. But now it was through things like reality TV, through webcams, through the internet. And so we wanted to ask, well, in what ways is the domestic still an interesting or rich topic in an art context in this new age? Which brought us to the exhibition. As we mentioned, we began talking about it probably in sort of late 2008, early 2009, and spent a good amount of time going through the work of photographers, having conversations ourselves about our own work and what we saw that had changed and developed in our own practices since the time we were graduate students. And in early 2010, we had started to put out feelers once we had a roster of artists we wanted to include, and a place called the Alice Austin House. It's a museum in Staten Island. Have any of you been or know of it? Agreed to show the work, and we were thrilled. It was our first choice, and the reason is that, as you'll see in a moment as we go through the work, we don't actually include that stage of the house. You don't see the living room or the kitchen or the bathroom as the stage
or the television set
in these pictures. But because in some ways we felt that it's implied. You don't need to see it anymore. We've seen those pictures before, but they all deal with domesticity. So what we wanted to do as a curatorial gesture is actually put this work that we had compiled of artists who were dealing with domesticity, but in either a more micro or macro way, actually into a literal house. So the Alice Austin House, which is now a museum devoted to Alice Austin, a very important late 19th, early 20th century photographer from New York City. This is her former house. It's now a museum. She's a photographer. She had this Victorian home, and we thought, what a perfect context to have this exhibition. Since the stage has been removed from the pictures, now the pictures will be put actually back into the stage.
And it's a really unique space in the sense that they have these rooms that are in your view as you're walking through the house and looking at the exhibition that are staged according to this Victorian home. So the home was present. Not only was the work in a home, but the home was present. And so we didn't need to have a dining room or a drama unfold in a dining room. That stage, because it was present in the home.
Mm-hmm. And so you can imagine as you would walk through, there was a gallery space in the front, but in between the rooms, you would sort of get these views of a dining room or a kitchen. And so that you were always reminded of the literal domestic stage, even though the photographers that we selected were not including that. They didn't feel the need. This is an exterior view of this Victorian home. It's quite quaint and beautiful, as you can see. So the first picture that you were confronted with, at a slightly smaller size than you see it projected, but quite large, around 60 by 70 inches, was this picture, a photograph from a project called Mobile Homes Harsh Realty by a photographer named Peter Garfield. This was made in 1998. And we love this picture not only for its formal properties and qualities, but also because it in many ways looked like the house that you were in. So you had this notion of the house being exploded. And in many ways, that's what our exhibition set out to do, was to make you reconsider the domestic, reconsider these subject matters. There still is narrative in this work, as in the Pleasures and Terrors, but it's not maybe quite as direct or clear in the same ways. It's maybe a bit more, the pictures are maybe a bit more mysterious in a way. You can see more from the series. This is, again, Peter Garfield. Harsh Reality from 1998 is the series.
And when these were first exhibited, people had this belief that they were actual imploding homes. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't revealed until later that they were actually models.
We're just going to go through quite quickly of some of the artists in that show to talk about the domestic, a theme that is remains to be of interest to Katie and me, but the ways in which it sort of shifted for us and what we were looking for in the show house. This is the work of David Deutsch, who's mostly known as a painter, who made a series of photographs in the early 2000s where was it from a helicopter?
It was
from a helicopter in and around Los Angeles would make these surveillance images. These are probably not like nothing you've seen before in 2014 in the age of Google Maps and Google View. But you have to remember this is 2001, so this predates that sort of technology. And so this idea of seeing the domestic and the suburban space from this aerial perspective was something that we found quite interesting. And in many ways, we felt that Deutsch was sort of ahead of the curve in terms of the way in which we understand this private domestic realm.
And if we could just go back to the invite, Joe and I were
Go back for a minute.
not only referencing David's picture in this invite, but we decided to use this new technology as a way to lay claim to where the exhibition was. And this is a Google Earth image, obviously.
So here are a few more of David Deutsch's pictures. This is the work of a photographer named Catherine Parker Almanas. It's a series that she did around 2006 called Pastry Anatomy. And they're these dissected pictures of danishes and pastries. This notion of looking at the domestic or the familiar in a very analytical and even clinical way was something that we were interested in. So it's a much more sort of scientific, analytical approach as opposed to maybe the directly narrative, highly psychological approach of the Pleasures and Terrors exhibition. I mean, there's certainly a psychological energy to these photographs, but it comes through analysis as opposed to through maybe a kind of conventional notion of narrative.
And again, we felt, especially in this work, that you didn't need the stage to understand the link that it had to domesticity and that stage. That you could literally remove it and still have that kind of narrative potential in looking at the work.
This is the work of Catherine Opie. This is a self-portrait that she made in 1993, and in many ways was one of our starting points for the exhibition. One of the things that we did when we decided we were going to do a show is said, okay, in the early 90s, who was making work that was not included in the Pleasures and Terrors show, and why were they not included? There was one reference to queerness in the Pleasures and Terrors show, but it was a very sort of obscure, a very sort of hidden reference that you may not have noticed. Where a few years later, in 1993, Catherine Opie makes a very explicit and in many ways a sort of seemingly, I think, a painful image about about domesticity, inclusion, exclusion. Where we have, this is a self-portrait of Catherine Opie where she's carved a nuclear family on her back, and we see two women together. And it's freshly bleeding. So this was a picture that we really thought would be important for the show and struggled to get, and we actually managed to get for the exhibition, which was a huge triumph, thanks to some secret connections that I can't say while I'm mic'd.
It was a triumph, wasn't it?
I don't want to get you in trouble, Katie. But Katie managed to, we're two artists doing this exhibition, and we thought, like, we would love to have this picture. How can we get it? And
it sold out, so she didn't own it.
And I should also mention that I was a student in the year that we weren't at Yale together. It was 1 year before Katie. Kathy Opie was my teacher. So we were actually able to contact Kathy directly and say, Kathy, is there any way we can get it? And she said, I would like to help you, but there's no way. It's a sold out picture. There's just no way. So somehow through luck and some of Katie's skill, we managed to secure the picture for the show, which for us felt like a real, when that happened, we felt like, okay, this is meant to be. We really need to do this exhibition. And
I just want to add to that while we're curating this show, I had just had my second child. So I'm on the phone with collectors trying to wheel and deal to get this piece while I have a young child on my breast. And so I was deeply involved in my own domestic space and my own domestic life. So it was really refreshing to sort of think about curating a show that would step outside of that.
But this, I think some of you can see in Opie's work, like in Catherine Parker Almanas' work, is this notion of dissection, of breaking things down, of analyzing. So it's a much more analytical approach to the domestic, but there are these kind of connections still that we think were worth exploring and worth looking at. This is the work by a photographer named, a conceptual artist really, who often works in photography, named Penelope Umbrico, who made a series called Mirrors from around 2002 to 2007. And we included one of these pictures. What the photographs are they're images from interior catalogs, so catalogs that show interior spaces that you would get in the mail to sell something. And in those spaces, if there was a picture of, say, a living room, and in the living room was a picture of a mirror, what Umbrico does is she would cut out that mirror from the catalog, and then enlarge it back to the actual size that the mirror would be, and that's why you get that very pixelated thing. So these are images from consumer catalogs to sell lifestyle through products that she's turned into actual objects that then hang on the wall and look sort of like a mirror. Umbrico says about the work, and this is the picture that we included in the show, while the mirrors in these catalogs serve to locate the viewer within the space by reflecting what would be behind him or her, all the seductive trappings arranged in the mirror's reflection become surrogates for the missing reflection of the viewer. The viewer witnesses his own disappearance and replacement by sellable objects. So we were interested in this work too, in the ways in which it really sort of changes the domestic space, and all of a sudden the domestic space becomes, like the marketplace. It's part of sort of where market and capital and consumerism occurs. And you all know this. I mean, this, when Pleasures and Terrors happened, that's pre-Amazon. People weren't online shopping in 1991. By 2007, that's where, you didn't go to the store. You actually just sat at your computer in your private space and did what was previously a very public transaction. And so we were interested in these sort of ideas, which we think a lot of Umbrico's work.
I just want to add to that what was interesting about the Umbrico work as well is that these were obvious references to domestic spaces that were literally staged. So it was exciting to sort of make that connection between the stage of the domestic space and then these actual staged domestic spaces. Twice or three times removed, right?
And in the show, this picture, which has a fireplace, was actually positioned near the actual fireplace in the former parlor of the house. This is the work of a good friend of both of ours and sometimes collaborator, the photographer Victoria Sambanaris, who has spent the last decade, or actually a bit more than that now, making annual 3 to 6 month long road trips across the United States to document the landscape and to look at sort of social or cultural things through the land. What we found so interesting about these pictures, beyond their incredible beauty, actually the reproductions are not ideal, but beyond the actual beauty of her work, is that this is a tradition, historically in the United States, the idea of going out into the landscape has been around since the beginning of the United States as we understand it as a country, this notion of moving west. But Vicky is working in a lineage that is exclusively male. All of the great photographers of the 19th century that would actually go out into public realm and sort of the pioneers were men. And so here we have a woman who is actually going out into the landscape and making these pictures that look at very public space from a female perspective. So we thought that very much like our enthusiasm about having the exhibition exist in the Alice Austin House, the home of a female queer photographer, that this was also an important gesture in terms of thinking about new definitions of public and private and of the domestic.
Yeah, and what's important about the work also is that here is this woman who's leaving the domestic space to go out into the unknown sort of and conquer the land, which is a shift in the gender roles.
And lastly, this is the work of a photographer named Matt Ducklow. It's a series called Newscasters, and we included one of these pictures because we thought there still is stages in the home. I mean, we wanted this is a stage, of course, but it's not, we're not showing you a picture of a living room of people watching the TV. We've removed that, but what we've left is these very strange pictures that Matt Ducklow has made of newscasters. So this is information coming into the house. Right, and you all look at these and you understand without seeing the TV set that it's the TV, right? You know that that's what it is. And as so many of the pictures in the Pleasures and Terrors had the TV set as a central part of the photograph, we thought it would be amazing to include this work where the set of the TV is removed, but you still understand that it's suggested. You know exactly what these are without us telling you.
And it's again this the space where the public and private come together.
In terms of narrative, in the Pleasures and Terrors, that show gave us all of these great pictures of domesticity, which in an art context for the first time we saw the domestic space looked at with a lot of attention to detail and to nuance. By the early 2000s, what Katie and I were proposing with the show is that you didn't need to necessarily show that entire stage, that it could be implied. So we still think these pictures are narrative, but you come to these photographs with an understanding of this being in the living room, so we don't need to show you the living room. And so we think it's not that the work in House is not narrative, but I think that it engages the viewer in a different way than the work from the Pleasures and Terrors show from about 2 decades
And it was
ago.
also an opportunity for us to highlight that this domestic space and domesticity is still something that artists were turning to for inspiration and were interested in looking at, but that ultimately we were looking at it in new ways. One of the last curatorial gestures we should talk about in House is this chat roulette. Does anyone know about chat roulette? Okay.
It'd be a good sort of segue into Picture Consequences, where we're sort of dealing, where Katie and I are actually engaging the internet and online as a part of our practice, both as curators and artists. So you guys know what chat roulette is? It's sort of amazing to be in this moment where technology that's on everyone's mind from 2 years ago is in a way obsolete 2 years later. So we even had to go back. House was curated in 2010, and chat roulette had just come out. And at the center of our exhibition at the Alice Austin House, we had a station with a laptop. And visitors to the show could actually get onto chat roulette, which is normally a way in which people can engage with a stranger from anywhere in the world at random, but it's usually done in one's private space. And a lot of the exchange that happens is sexual in nature. And so we had this set up, and unfortunately, on the first day, the content was so explicit that it got censored out of the show. So you had to be at the opening for the first hour. If you went, it was kind of.
It was literally an hour.
And
they shut us down.
And the opening was on Sunday at noon. We thought on Sunday at noon it would be a bit more tame. It was not, because it's international. So Sunday at noon there is different times. It's deep in the night other places. So the content was still very, very charged. But we love this idea of creating a chat roulette station where strangers would now enter into the exhibition and be confronted with someone who's coming to see an art exhibition, as opposed to someone in their living room or bedroom or bathroom.
But it was also interesting to us that this incredible technology where you could essentially communicate with anybody in the world at any given moment would be reduced to this explicit sexual exchange. Very little conversing happening on chat roulette.
Yeah, or content beyond that sort of basic.
It's hard not to imagine that picture at the other end of the chat roulette.
Yeah.
Going on chat roulette,
Right.
they stare down at the local news team.
That's kind of amazing, right, to consider. We were very glad that the great curator and writer Susan Bright agreed to write an essay for our exhibition called A Guided Tour, which we brought some of the catalogs. And this was published both as its own catalog, as we're passing around to you, as well as an essay in the magazine Dear Dave. So this was important for us too, so that there would be something that existed beyond the actual exhibition. Which takes us to Picture Consequences. I know that was sort of we wanted to kind of give you a sense of how we've been collaborating and thinking, because we think it'll help you to better understand what got us to Picture Consequences and why we actually did this collaborative project as artists. I think it was probably the end of 2010, I was approached by a friend of a friend who had gone to see House, who really liked the show, who had started a new gallery in Long Island City called the Homefront Gallery, and said to me, would you be interested in curating another show as either a follow-up to House or something else? And I thought, well, Katie and I we're not curators, we're artists, and we had an idea, and we put everything we could into House, and that was the show we needed to do at that moment.
But it was also deeply influential for both of us to curate this show, because through curation, we understood even more than we had originally understood the ways in which pictures speak to one another and the language between images. Now, in editing and working on my own series, and I'm sure in yourself, we're always kind of thinking about connections between images. But it was new and exciting for me to sort of take others' works and draw those connections.
So we were thinking so much about the relationships between pictures, narrative not only in a singular photograph, but the narrative that can arise when you put two pictures together. This idea that if you have two pictures, right, you have the meaning or the narrative of one photograph, the meaning or the narrative of a second photograph, and if you add those two together, you don't get two, you actually get three, because the third meaning becomes the relationship or the new narrative that exists between the two pictures. So this is something, as working as curators, we thought a lot about. And so after giving it some thought, it was January of 2011. And I had to get back to this gallerist and let her know if I was going to do a show or what I was going to do. And right after the new year, I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but I got an email from Katie, and there was no text. All it was an attachment, and this was the picture. And I know Katie very well, and I know Katie's family very well, so I know that that's her partner and husband of many years, Ed, in bed with a broken leg. And so I get this and think, like, what has happened? And could you give me some information? And not just, because I was really concerned. So I called her right away and said, what happened? And I thought there was something kind of amazing that Katie had decided, rather than calling me to say Ed slipped on the ice and broke his leg doing an act of kindness for the neighbor, that instead she just sent me the picture. And so we started to talk about that, right? That idea of sending a picture instead of sending words. And we decided, well, why don't we do an exhibition together? Instead of curating something, why don't we collaborate and do an exchange of pictures and see if we can rely on photographs as a way to communicate with each other? Because that's pretty much what Katie had done. She had sent me this photograph, and I had to read the picture to understand a story. And I had to look at it and say, is this true? Is this not true? Is this now? Is this in the past? There were so many questions that it provoked, but it was definitely a very narrative, provocative picture.
Yeah, and I should just give a little bit of backstory. I mean, so much had happened in such a short period of time. So I live in a two-family house, and we had this old woman tenant who was about 75 years old, and she passed away, and we found her body like a day or two later. Her friends were calling us, like, we haven't heard from her. So that was a really startling and horrible experience to find her. And I felt like the house sort of was draped in this sort of darkness and death for a few days. In the midst of emptying out all of her things and preparing the apartment for someone else to rent, my husband went to give the garbage man a tip because there was so much garbage, and slipped on this black ice and then broke his leg. So now we have this gutted apartment where a woman had just died, and now I have a husband who's laid up with no, can't help me. I have two little kids, and it just seemed too much to kind of describe in a long email. And so, as opposed to doing that, I made this portrait.
And then sent it to me. So it was kind of shocking, right?
And it was the new year. It was
yeah,
like a few days
in the
into
new year,
the new
you're
year.
expecting sort of joyous things about new beginnings and new potential, and you get this picture and think, oh no. And so
Death and disability.
And I remember, sort of then the new semester had began, and we met at the diner as we often would.
Yes.
And we sat down and we just started talking. We said, well, why don't we, that's it. Like the idea for the show, the next show that I was invited to do, we already knew what we could do. I said, Katie, would you be willing to do something? And she said, of course. And we talked a little bit about it, and it didn't take much conversation to figure out what we wanted to do, which became Picture Consequences. So what I'm going to do is we want to read you you can read along too if you want, but I think it's important to just go over this. What I should say before we read this to you is that the project has three components. A first component, which was an actual exchange on a blog that Katie and I did for 90 days. So that was a web component, where it was a private blog where we would put pictures and then respond to each other. Following that was an actual exhibition that took place from the end of June through the end of August 2011, and we'll talk a little bit about how we made that transition from the web blog to the exhibition. And then the third component is the website that now exists as an archive. So that's it still has a web presence that exists. That's an actual website we made to complement the exhibition, but then that would also live beyond the show.
Before you read that, I think we should also talk about how when we were curating the house show, the thing that we felt was not representative in the works that were available to us and that we knew of at that time was really interesting work that was made using the website, a website, or web-based work, this is pre-Doug Rickard, pre-Google, or there was not a lot of attention being paid or works being made using this. So it was important for us to take this element that we saw lacking and to incorporate it into this project.
And in-house, the reason why we ultimately put the chat roulette station as our own contribution was because we couldn't find work that really dealt with the internet in the ways that we were interested. A lot changed between even 2010 and now. I mean, there's tons of that kind of work now that you can probably think of. So this was a way for us to engage these new technologies and things that we were thinking about with House but couldn't quite find the right work to put into that show.
And it just seemed that new technology is the perfect place for a spontaneous dialogue through pictures.
So I'm going to read to you the sort of the overarching idea of the show, and then Katie will read you the rules. Picture Consequences is the culmination of a 90-day photographic conversation in which I and Katie Murray exchange new and archived pictures online. Taking into consideration the rise of the internet as the primary platform for reading photographs and the current zeitgeist of working among genres and formats, Maida and Murray's resulting exhibition re-contextualizes their work and attests to their shared belief in the power of photographic pictures as potent language, metaphor, riddle, and game. The rules of their conversation follow.
The first rule, we will engage in an online photographic conversation for 90 days. We will begin our correspondence at 12:01 a.m. on March 1st and will conclude at 11:59 p.m. on May 29th, 2011. We will take turns, each posting a picture in response to the other's most recent post. We will respond to one another's posts within 24 hours. We may respond sooner, but may not take more than 24 hours to reply. We will only converse with photographs drawn from our own archives or made in direct response to the last photograph posted. We will not post any supplementary material or text. We will not discuss our photographic conversation with one another outside of our online picture exchange. And number 7, we will translate our resulting conversation into an exhibition at the conclusion of our conversation. So no lyric diner.
No,
for
so
90 days.
we really didn't, and if we did see, I mean, of course we would see each other at art events, and we saw each other but we had a strict rule. We didn't see each other that often, but we had a strict rule that we could not talk about anything dealing with this, and we really tried to not talk about photography in general. Because we tried to rely on the fact that we had known each other for this point for over a decade, and we had spent the last decade talking about photographs most of the time when we're together, right? That comes into the conversation. So we figured, okay, let's actually see, like, how fluent are we in photography? And one of the ideas that we had is that we were hoping that we were actually more fluent in this language than even spoken or written English. That this is the language that we really have committed our time as students to studying, and that had spent our adult lives up until that moment, our careers were devoted to using this language and thinking about the language. One thing that I want to add is that in engaging in this conversation that we had, it was not only about the making of pictures and using them to express ideas, but it was also about the reading of pictures and understanding what was happening on the other end. So with these exchanges, it was, we'd have to look at the previous image that Katie would post or that I would post and think about what is the other person trying to convey and how will I keep this conversation going? Do I want to continue in this conversation? Do I want to challenge the conversation? Do I want to abruptly change the conversation? So we used all of the same ideas that you can use in spoken conversation, but relying on visual and specifically photographic imagery.
Yeah, and I think that was a really important discovery, this notion that not only had we become makers of photographs, but that we were also the readers of photographs as well. And that was a tool that we had to rely heavily on in participating in this project.
This was also, our lives were happening. We were teaching and making work and having our own practices as artists. So it's not that this was, 90 days where at some point each day within a 24-hour period, we'd have to sit down at the computer, check what was posted, depending on whose turn it was, and then think about what we were going to give in response within 24 hours. As photographers who have been working, now for over 15 years, we have pretty extensive archives, a good amount of which are still analog. So there was also this idea where sometimes there would be a picture that would be the perfect response, but that would require scanning a negative. We know
finding a negative.
Finding a negative,
and then
right?
scanning
That
a
was the
negative.
harder part, finding it. So we would use our archives. We could also make new pictures, which we did at times. And we discussed a lot of things, and we went really around the world. I mean, we had this sort of experience that in some ways was all-inclusive, but I think in other ways was very specific and to our own experience as individuals, as artists, as close friends. So I think a lot of very personal things are also revealed throughout the conversation.
And at 24 hours might seem like a long time, but I felt like it was a pressure cooker environment. Like a picture would come up maybe, and sometimes it wouldn't come up until late in the day, and I'd be like, panicked. What do I do? How do I respond to this? And it was really a fun, although sometimes terrifying game to participate in.
This takes you back to the pictures we started on. So a moment where unknowingly, Katie and I, both sort of went back to a similar moment in our archive and pulled pictures that were made from a similar period where we were studying with the same person from two different institutions. These pictures sort of now live together in a way.
And it was important for us, even if you visit the website, there's no name attached to any of the images. So it's not about, oh, this is Joe's picture or this is Katie's picture, but that it becomes this new thing. And that together, it's this third element.
Mm-hmm. And one that's really, I think, a testament to the power of collaboration. I mean, there are certain times where what you can achieve through collaboratively is much greater than what you can do individually. And that was something we were also really interested in exploring through this work. So we actually want to engage you now a bit in this whole idea of the picture consequence, and ask you, how do you read this picture, and what do you think comes next? How do you read this picture? I mean, what do you think it's about? What do you see in it? Because that's something that we're always curious, because sometimes Katie would respond to me and I thought, what? Or vice versa. And we couldn't talk about it. I'd be like, what? And then I'd have to really go back and analyze her picture and say like, oh, that's, or I'd have to analyze my picture and see something I hadn't seen in a picture before. So, I mean, how do you analyze this picture? What's the narrative that you can tell from it? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good reading. Did you something too? Yeah, let's hear all the responses, and then we can show what comes next. Let's go in the back, and then we'll come to the front. Mm-hmm. It's a self-presentation in a way. So we'll show you what came next. Maybe not what you were expecting, but actually, if you look closely, it's not so far off from the things that you were talking about. So I think this was the pleasure of this game that we were playing, right? That in some ways, like all of the things that you said were exactly accurate and things that we were thinking about, but the ways in which those ideas can manifest them in their picture is, there's many ways in which that can manifest itself. And there was always the great surprise of, if you posted a picture and then had to step away from the computer for a while and you would come back and then there was this response that you didn't expect.
Yeah. And I think that the connection between the previous picture and this picture is just about absurdity in a lot of ways, which is something that no one had mentioned.
Any guesses for what comes next?
Ham sandwich.
Let's see if it's a ham sandwich. It's not a ham sandwich.
I don't remember what was after that.
Oh, there's a nice picture after this one, actually.
Yeah.
So for 90 days, 3 months, it's kind of a good amount of time if you think about it. I mean, it's the length of a traditional semester. I mean, it's a quarter of the year. It was a good amount of time. I think there was a sort of fun to it for sure for the first week, the first 2 weeks, the first month maybe. And then there were moments where at some point you thought like, okay, the fun is over, right? Can we stop? But then you had to work through it and actually get somewhere else. And I think that part of this idea of doing it for 3 months was to not just make it about fun, but to also make it a very an intense exercise to make us reconsider how we were approaching our own photographs, how we were approaching the medium in general, and how we wanted to reconsider where photography was headed, at this point in 2011 through these new technologies that everyone we knew were using. think in looking at the photographs, you can probably see some influence from even the Pleasures and Terror show that we spoke about. And it is important to reiterate that the photographs we were pulling from is an archive of over 15 years each. So sometimes the pictures would go back in time to the mid to late 90s, and sometimes the picture had just been made. So we're really spanning a pretty long period of time, but from two specific photographic voices who share many similar interests and beliefs about this particular medium.
And I think what was really exciting for me, a couple of weeks into it, is that it felt like, improvisational jazz or something. It had this other kind of organic playfulness to it that I had never experienced before in my working practice. Photography can be so often a solitary experience. Even if you are photographing others, it's still you in your head behind a camera looking through something. And this was exciting to engage in this dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that we were ever interested in making pictures together.
Right, it was
which
never
some
about
artists
that.
do in collaboration, but it was about taking our own voices and sort of having a play, a back and forth kind of playfulness.
And I think that the pictures, there is a lot of, in terms of the ways that one reads photographs, there's, sometimes the exchange was a very formal one. We both do appreciate the form of a picture and how a picture is made. Sometimes it had everything to do with the narrative of the picture. And I think in the best exchanges, it was actually functioning on multiple levels of reading, where it was both the narrative and the form, and maybe it was also the psychology. So I think for us, the sort of most successful exchanges were one that were not just a kind of singular reading of the picture, but one that acknowledged that photographs can be made to communicate ideas and can be read to explore ideas on multiple registers at once. Pictures, there's a saying, right, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think that we really believe that it's that or more.
And here we are in the desert. So how do you respond to this, you think?
What's the narrative? We can talk about the literal thing that we see, right? And then what it's of. There's something that it's of, right? And then there's what it's about. So what is it about? We can all see what it's of.
I think one of the things that you're told as a young photography student is to find your voice and to have a voice and to make work out of that position in that place. And it was really interesting to sort of, the two of us, to sublimate that and let this other thing come through. It's sort of the thing that you're never told to do, is to make pictures that could coexist with someone else's, and you don't know who's the owner of one picture versus the other. I think that's inherent in the medium because the medium doesn't show the artist's hand necessarily.
While we're going through the last bit of photographs from this, I want to just reiterate too that Katie and I, before this, during this, and since this, have maintained our individual creative practices. So there's this. What's really been, what was so, I think, exciting for us in this is that when you make work as a photographer, there is something very solitary about it. You're kind of on your own with the camera, and in this way, it allowed, for me, for sure, to go back and look at pictures that I had made. And for the first time, photography, which I saw as a very solitary pursuit, became this kind of collaborative thing where it was actually about an exchange. And so for me, that was a really kind of rewarding aspect to the project. And so now when I go out and make pictures, I think it's even changed the ways in which I make photographs. I think so much more now, not only about what I want to express in making a picture, the narrative or the story that I want to tell, but then I also think about how different viewers may come to that picture and what narrative he or she may read in the picture depending on what the viewer's own personal experience is.
It was also a great opportunity to take pictures that didn't, in my case, have a home. I had been working on various different series, and but that doesn't prevent me from making pictures and responding to things that I find interesting. But sometimes they just have nowhere to land, and it doesn't mean that they're less valuable. So it was an exciting chance to have those pictures live in the world, in a space. All of this might seem really obvious in 2014 when there's so much use of Instagram, and people more often than not with Snapchat and things like that are conversing in images. But when we did it in 2011, it seemed like a really new idea, a new approach. And even though there were sort of picture exchanges happening, we wanted to elevate the conversation and be really thoughtful and considerate about this exchange. So what do you do after this?
Another dog.
Naturally that. And just like in normal conversation, there are moments where we're, more serious, maybe a little bit more intellectual, and then there are times where we're humorous and random. I mean, conversation flows so randomly sometimes, and you go off topic and then you go back on topic.
So while Katie's going through the last bit of the conversation, I'll talk a bit about where we're headed now here in terms of our talk, which is how then we, at the end of March, had to figure out how to turn this into an exhibition over the course of 2 months. So after 90 days of corresponding, we had around 100 pictures. And we looked at the archive very closely. We spent some time thinking about which photographs had surprised us, had shocked us, and then we actually had for the first time the chance to talk about the work. So you can imagine that conversation was a very long, exciting one. We met at the Lyric Diner, probably drank more coffee than I ever have because it was a long meeting, and just talked about everything that had happened, all of the things that all the questions that we had the chance to ask. And then what we also had to do is to sort of talk about what we thought were the most exciting moments. When was the conversation the most interesting? And so after we left the Lyric Diner, we both went home and we selected what we came to call runs, parts of the conversation that we thought were the most successful. It could be like a phrase, it could be like a sentence, it could be like a paragraph, depending on how many pictures in a row we thought were an interesting thought or an interesting idea. And we each made our selections, and then we compared notes, and we looked at where things overlapped. And so like I would have maybe said, these 3 pictures are great, and Katie would have said, well, these other 3 pictures are great, but 2 of the pictures from each of our 3s overlap. So we said, okay, there's something there. And we started to pull what we thought together were the most interesting moments, and made small printouts and kind of like a model of the space in which we'd be showing it, and started to think how we would then install that work into the exhibition space.
Yeah, so just because we had completed the first portion of this project, which was this 90-day sort of difficult at times, but thrilling exchange, we still had to do something with it. So we had this enormous archive of 99 images, right? And when I think about it in hindsight, it's really interesting that because now so many artists are looking at the enormous visual archive that is available to us through the internet. But we used the internet to create this archive, which was a personal archive, and then we curated a show out of that archive.
And in making the exhibition, we came back to something that I think we both really believe in, that if a picture is well made and if all of the, if the form and the narrative and the psychology are considered, that the picture should stand up on a wall and be able to be looked at for more than a second and reveal things as you spend more time looking at it. And as two artists who came to photography in many ways through like the photographic book, right? So through these great works of photography that were published in monographs, and where there was a kind of narrative not only in singular pictures but in the relationship between a series of pictures. For us, we were thinking about returning what was originally maybe made in a kind of as a print, then that became part of our conversation online, back to a print on the wall. And so here's one of the runs from the show. Maybe this is the longest run that we included. And in considering how to install the show, as Katie mentioned, we decided that we wouldn't give credit to one or the other. So we wouldn't say like, you know, Murray, Maida, Murray, like we wouldn't give that sort of, we would just call it picture consequence number, and it would have a number. And then the title would be the date from what date to what date. So, you know, in this case, I think it was April 2nd through April 8th, right? So to say April 2nd through April 8th, and the times from when the first and the last picture were posted. So we'd pull that information from the web, but then put it back into a series of prints, and they were framed so that when they were hung on the wall, they would actually kiss. So they would be pressed right against each other and create a singular piece. And we also had to decide too that the work would now exist together, that even if these photographs had existed in a different context before, they were now part of this collaborative work. So this was the piece. It wasn't like you could go in and say, oh, I'd really like to have
Number three.
Number three. That was the work. The work became this collaborative thing that we had agreed on together. This was another one of the runs from the show, which we had thought a lot about the experience of scrolling up and down on the blog, in which we were experiencing the work digitally online. So we figured that we weren't limited to just a kind of left to right reading, that there could be a right to left reading or an up and down reading. So throughout the show, it wasn't always in a kind of more conventional horizontal presentation. There were also these vertical runs like this one of 3 pictures, which was much more closely aligned to how we were experiencing the work on the blog. We want to conclude by talking about, very briefly, about how our collaboration has continued, because in fact it has. And so 2011 was the Picture Consequences show. In 2012, a friend of ours came to us and said, someone just came to me and said and asked me to curate a show, what should I do? And we said, well, we have a good idea. Why don't you do something like Picture Consequences? And we said, and naturally, if you do it, you have to include us, right? And so this other person was the photographer that we had included in-house, Victoria Sambanaris. The architect, Deborah Burke, who is an amazingly creative, incredibly talented architect here in New York City, who has always supported artists and always allotted a part of her office space for exhibition. She has an exhibition space in her office. And she had asked Vicki to put together a show. Vicki came to us and we had a conversation, and Vicki said, yeah, let's do something like Picture Consequences.
Except in this iteration of Picture Consequences, Deborah supplied a word, and that word would be posted, and then a group of us, which was to include Joe, myself, Victoria Seminaris, and Dan Torup, started to have a Picture Consequences conversation around the word that Deborah Burke supplied.
To at least get a start. We always had to think about the word for each. So there was 3 months, but each month had a word that the architect, Deborah Burke, supplied. Then the 4 of us would engage in a conversation. So in a way, it sort of doubled, right? Because we were 2 before and now we were 4. And there was one other element which was really kind of fun and exciting, which was that each month, the 4 of us, only one of the 3 months, could tap somebody to
substitute,
to stand in for us and or post in addition to us, and the person would not be revealed. So we each had the opportunity to tap another
someone,
photographer
right,
that we liked or respected. And so a new voice could be interjected at any moment, but no one would know because all of the posts are anonymous. So no one would know. I wouldn't know looking at the pictures unless I knew the picture before if one was Katie's. And now there were these other 4 voices that were entering the conversation, which would only be revealed at the very end.
And what Deborah's office did is that they would each week print out the results of the previous week's conversation, just laser prints, and post them on the walls around the office. And then her staff was asked to put Post-its on images that they were responding to, negatively or positively.
Not knowing what was what or whose was whose. And so at the end of the 3-month exchange,
they started to collaborate.
So we had
as
them
well.
engaged. I mean, it's sort of like an analog Instagram in a way. I mean, it's real people in a real space posting comments.
Right.
But at the end of the 90 days, then we all gathered and we went in and looked at what was written and saw what got the most response, whether negative or positive, and started to figure out how similarly we would create an exhibition, which lived in Deborah Burke's office for a few months in
12, I think.
2011, actually. It's the end of 2011. And Deborah Burke her office published a very beautiful catalog that traces the exchange and the exhibition, which we can pass around and share with you. And then, as Katie and I already mentioned, our collaboration continues in the classroom now, where we now collaborate with our students in a way through engaging in picture consequences in a class also called Picture Consequences.
Yeah, I think that's it, right?
Do you guys have any questions? Yes, in the back. So the question is, did we make a lot of photos or do we just pull from the archive? In my case, I made some pictures, but the majority for me were from the archive. As a photographer, I'm always, scanning negatives or keeping pictures that I really like but that don't have a home. And so I had a kind of mini folder, and then I would also sort of try to prepare in advance, which never worked. But I would sometimes be like, I'm going to sit, because I'm at the scanner, and I'm going to scan 50 really good pictures I've never scanned, because one of those is going to work for the next response. And I got a lot of scanning done, but rarely did it actually work. You couldn't, that was kind of I'm such a kind of type A personality that I like to plan in advance. And this is not, I learned how to be a little more type B. I think that was good for me. How about you?
And in my case, I made a lot of pictures in response, partially because, as I said before, I had a small child, and I have 2 children, and they were both very young and needy, and I didn't always have, it was just easier to kind of sometimes go like, oh, screw it, I'll just make a picture, rather than dig through my archive, find a negative, try to scan it, look through contact sheets that were buried somewhere. And I also like the challenge of trying to respond immediately and intuitively and spontaneously to the thing that I was saying. So I made a lot of new pictures for the exchange.
Yeah, on the front. So the question is, at the beginning of the talk, we talked about the Pleasures and Terrors exhibition, right? And
Peter Galassi
and putting that exhibition, working at the Museum of Modern Art, which is known specifically for a modernist tradition, came into the position as the director of photography following John Sarkowski, who was really celebrated for his helping to define a modernist vision of photography. So Galassi comes in after him and has to sort of deal with both the tradition that the MoMA had established of modernist photography while also acknowledging postmodern photography, which comes of age starting in the mid to late 70s, and then sort of happens mostly through the 80s. So the exhibition is looking mostly at the 1980s, a little bit of work from the 70s, where there's a lot of work that's being coined postmodern. So I think what we first maybe have to do is define a bit more clearly this distinction between modern and postmodern, right? And then we can talk about what Galassi did or what he was sort of trying to do.
Well, I just want to go back. So it wasn't our intention to sort of bridge the gap between modernism and postmodernism in-house. That was actually Galassi's job to do in Pleasures and Terrors, that he wanted to do, to reconcile these two opposing, or what was seemingly opposing sides. And a lot of the work that was made in the 80s was considered postmodernist and wasn't really regarded by Sarkowski. And so Galassi had this opportunity to sort of put together these two sides in this one show. And where he could find that they came together was in the domestic space. So I guess the postmodernist work is the sort of staged photographs, the photographs that are subconsciously made, that are not necessarily part of a photographic tradition that is interested in documenting things and kind of capturing something spontaneously.
And I think also with postmodernism, there were, of course, criticisms of the Pleasures and Terror show for excluding some work that might have fallen more explicitly into a postmodern camp, work that was very socially and politically engaged, that was looking at kind of current issues in the 80s, like issues that were at the forefront of social concern, at cultural concern, political concern. I think right in the review of the show, Barbara Kruger, a very interesting photographer who was excluded, a very important photographer at the time, was not included, and it sort of noted in the New York Times review that why wasn't she included, and maybe in some ways her work was using such, it was so postmodern in the way that it was functioning that maybe it couldn't be positioned in a show that still did have one foot in the modernist tradition. So the question is, were there any drastic differences when we got together at the end of the 90-day exchange and actually got to talk about it? Were there any drastic differences in terms of how we were approaching things? I think there were some.
For me, sure. I mean, I was always surprised by the responses that Joe would have. And I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, we're both coming, even though we have a shared history in terms of our education in photography, our history as people and as human beings living in the world is, you know, at times similar, but at times vastly different. And so I think that is where we found there was the most room for interpretation.
And I think probably the attraction to the attraction in terms of our good friendship, but also wanting to collaborate together, is that there is a lot of difference. So, you know, being attracted to something that's not the way you do things is, you know, I think if we were more alike, maybe the conversation wouldn't have even been so interesting, because there were many moments where you were thinking about something in a different way than me, and you would post something and I would be so surprised by the response because it was outside of my frame, my either point of reference or sort of what I was thinking about at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, Joe, for me, is a very formally disciplined kind of photographer, and I don't consider myself that necessarily. And so I was always up against this form, this perfection of form that I had to sort of negotiate in my responses.
But similarly, I would often find moments where I would think that you're actually quite formal, but there's a kind of there's a slightly more spontaneous. I mean, I told you guys that I was, you know, frantically scanning negatives so I would be prepared.
And I was nursing, like making a picture.
So you can imagine there was a slightly different work method. But what we found, what Katie and I had already discovered in-house, which was, as proud of the exhibition as we both are, we will say that it was a ton of work. And there were moments when we were putting together that show, and I think we were already too far in to pull out, but I thought, like, this is much more work than anything I've ever experienced. To curate a show with a very, very limited budget at a very small institution, and to get the sort of caliber of work that we were able to get, to ensure the work, to transport the work, it was a lot of effort on our part. But what we learned in doing that was how well we worked together. I mean, I remember saying to Katie many times, like, there's no way that I'll ever curate a show again. And I mean, maybe now I will, but where I thought, like, I needed another person, because there were moments that were really frustrating or difficult, and you have a sort of someone you can talk to and engage with.
And I think that we find that in teaching too, right?
Teaching together.
We're always saying we're really one brain.
One very big brain. Yes. It's different. Yeah, it's sort of something that we kind of like there to be a mystery around. We tell the students coming into the class, it's like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Right. What happens in Picture Consequences is supposed to stay in Picture Consequences.
So there are rules, and we do use a website, and they engage in a dialogue.
But there's a lot that's not revealed, and there's a lot of surprises throughout the course of the semester, and as we find out that certain things are maybe being leaked and people come in knowing things, we have to sort of switch it up. But we like for there to be a kind of level of I mean, I think in so many classes you go in and there's such a clear idea about this is what you have to do, and it's all, and what we're trying to do in this class is to allow for you to think in ways that you don't normally think, to actually kind of challenge your brain in ways that you don't normally challenge it, especially in an academic setting.
And I think what we want for our students is to have a similar experience that we had, and to discover something not only about their work, but their ways in which they interpret others' works. Any others? Yeah.
Oh, well, mine's not really so much. Well, it's a question. Do you guys know the website Dump FM?
What is it again?
Dump.fm?
Dump.fm.
Yeah.
No.
so
No,
it's
but I'm
like-
writing that down right now.
Yeah, you should
In
check
my
it out.
notes.
I thought about it when you mentioned chat roulette, and then like I knew kind of like what the concept about picture consequences was, and it seemed like it would really relate to like a lot of your interests. It's like this like online basically chat room where like it's kind of populated with like net artists, but also just people that discover it, and it's only using pictures, so people like it's like very digital, like people use like GIFs and like
Right.
they make like animated like text bubbles and stuff, and like they kind of like combine pictures to relate to things, but like it's basically just like a picture conversation.
So interesting.
Yeah, and
We'll
I
check
think
it out.
you should check it out. I think
What's important about what you're bringing up is that it exists solely on the web, right?
Yes.
And what was important for us is that it would then get removed from the web and have a place on the walls. Because I think we're so used to looking at images on the internet and on the web, and the scrolling and the swishing of the finger and moving it. We don't really spend a great amount of time actually digesting what it is that we're seeing. It all becomes visual noise after a while. And so that was why we were insistent upon having this thing exist on a wall and in printed form.
it's definitely much more like lowbrow.
Yeah.
But we like lowbrow too.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Maybe
yeah,
we
there's
like-
actually there's a lot of like artists that have work in
To check it out.
that use this website, but they're all like kind of dealing with like the digital sphere.
Yeah, we're at an interesting moment for sure. I mean, there's always been this kind of relationship between lowbrow and highbrow, especially with photography. I mean, it's sort of the medium that kind of does that the best. So and with the internet, I think it just allows for all the more ways in which we can kind of explore that. I think it's something that we're thinking a lot about in our collaborations and talking certainly a lot about in the classroom. Yeah, I mean, I should mention in the years before, so Katie and I have known each other a long time, but right before we did this exchange together, I think part of why we were spending maybe so much time together is I had spent the year 2008 in Japan on a fellowship. And I'd studied the language a bit before I got there in 2007, but so for a year I was gone. I was sort of removed from the New York community, from my close friends, sort of on my own. And when I was trying to learn Japanese and really polish my sort of ability, I relied heavily on manga because it's these pictures that would exist. There was language, but sometimes I couldn't read the language, so I'd have to rely on the pictures to understand what the text was saying. And so rather than sounding it out, which you can't do with all Japanese, if it's written in the Chinese kanji, you can't sound out a kanji. You have to sort of infer it by the picture. So I found myself spending so much time reading manga, but not actually reading in the sense of reading words, but actually reading pictures.
Yeah.
So I was definitely in that mindset when I returned to New York. So it's an interesting observation that you make. Yeah, thank you guys. I want to say one last thing, which is that, so Katie and I made the decision in talking to you guys today to not focus too much on our individual practices, but we both have individual practices. Katie has an amazingly beautiful book called All the Queen's Men, which came out this past fall that you guys should definitely have on your radar, which I think is, I mean, not only very beautiful photographs, but what you'll find in terms of thinking about narrative is that the way that the book is edited and sequenced is very, very rich in terms of narrative potential of photographs. So I would highly recommend that you guys check out this book, All the Queen's Men.
And I'll just say to that it was definitely influenced by my experience with picture consequences. It was, I think, a necessary component for me to create this book eventually, and to use that idea of storytelling between pictures.
And then the last thing is, so you can see our work online, and we didn't talk so much about our own individual practices because we were much more excited about the prospect of this. with you guys in terms of a narrative, a visual narrative course, but please check out our individual work too, because I think you'll find some similarities and some differences. But we also have these, this is all happening while we're then doing our own individual practices as artists. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.